Okay. As you can see, we've got Jenn Ashworth up on the screen. So she's in Lancaster, where it is raining more than usual, and she's been advised that she can't travel because it's not safe to travel. So it's really apocalyptic, isn't it, where you are, Jen, at the moment? But it's wonderful that we've got her here anyway, and we've got Richard Smyth with us as well. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Abby Curtis, and I'm part of the creative writing team. And this is an event which is part of the York Centre for Writing and also part of the York Literature Festival, with whom we have a strong relationship. I should say, just as a kind of housekeeping thing, that we aren't expecting any fire drills, fire alarms. So if one were to go off, your fire exit is there, or the door that you came in. If that does happen, don't panic and come around the front, because you're going to get tangled up in that wire. Just make sure that you just go either that way or that way, and just don't come around the front. Okay, but I'm sure that's not going to happen. So I'm going to start by introducing the two writers, and then they're going to read you extracts from their books, and then we're going to have a conversation between us, a Q&A, and then we're going to open the floor to you guys, and hopefully you've got lots of questions for them as well. So I've got some lovely introductions here to absolutely wonderful writers. Very different, but I think there will also be some synergies and similarities and things that we can talk about. So I will start with Jenn. Jenn Ashworth will be reading from and talking about her new novel, Ghosted. Look at this, it's so stunning. One ordinary morning, Laurie's husband Mark vanishes, leaving behind his phone and wallet. For 5 weeks, she tells no one, carrying on her job as a cleaner at the local university, visiting her difficult dementia-suffering father, and holing up in her tower block flat with a bottle to hand. When she finally reports Mark as missing, the police are suspicious. Why did she take so long? Wasn't she worried? It turns out there are many more lacunae in Laurie's account of events. At the time, she couldn't explain much of her behaviour herself. But as she looks back on the ensuing wreckage, the friendships broken, the wild accusations she made, the one-night stand, she starts to see more clearly what lay behind it. And if it's not too late, she might repair the damage, and most of all, forgive herself. Jenn Ashworth was born in 1982 in Preston. She studied English at Cambridge and since then has gained an MA from Manchester University, trained as a librarian and run a prison library in Lancashire. She now lectures in creative writing at the University of Lancaster. Her first novel, A Kind of Intimacy, was published in 2009 and won a Betty Trask Award. In 2011, her second, Cold Light, was published by Sceptre, and she was chosen by BBC's The Culture Show as one of the 12 best new British novelists. Her most recent novels, The Friday Gospels and Fell, were published to resounding critical acclaim. She has also written a memoir, Notes Made While Falling. She lives in Lancaster with her husband, son, and daughter. Richard Smyth will be reading from his first historical fiction novel, The Woodcock. It's 1920s England, and the coastal town of Gravely, is that right, Gravely, is finally enjoying a fragile peace after the Great War. John Lowell, a naturalist who writes articles on the flora and fauna of the shoreline, and his wife Harriet lead a simple life, basking in their love for each other, enjoying the company of John's visiting old school friend David. But when an American whaler arrives in town with his beautiful red-haired daughters, boasting of his plans to build a pier and pleasure grounds half a mile out to sea, unexpected tensions and temptations arise. As secrets multiply, Harriet, John, and David must each ask themselves, what price is to be paid for pleasure? Richard Smyth is a writer and critic. His work has appeared in The Guardian, New Statesman, and Times Literary Supplement, and he's the author of 5 books of non-fiction. In between books, he compiles crosswords and writes questions for television quizzes. He lives in Bradford, West Yorkshire, with his family. The Woodcock is his first historical novel. And here again, can I hold up your hardback? Because that's the stunner, isn't it? Here again, an absolutely beautiful book. Both books are outside if you're interested in buying either of them. I'm sure you want to buy both of them by the end of this. So I'm going to hand over to Jen, who's going to read from her novel Ghosted to get us started. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. Sound okay?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So I was going to read the opening, and then I changed my mind. So I'm going to read a bit from the middle because it's a bit spooky, in honour of the season and Halloween. So at this point in the novel, Laurie has started to tell people that Mark has gone missing. She is not, because she's left it such a long time, she expects that people are going to feel really sorry for her and look after her, but they don't. They're quite suspicious of her and quite angry. And this disappoints her, so she starts behaving even more badly. And we kind of pick up this section at the point where she realises that she's invited her mother-in-law to come to stay. She's very, very hungover. Her flat is in a mess. And she decides the best thing to do is to phone a telephone psychic and talk to that person about Mark. And I guess I chose this section because it brings a few things together that we might talk about later. It kind of brings quite a few ideas around ghosts together, that they're a way of thinking about what is there and what is not there. That ghosts can be scary, funny, embarrassing. They can be an excuse for people to fleece you for money. They can be ways of thinking about haunting and loss and grief. And it's also a way that Laurie starts to think about the possibility of the end of her marriage. And she starts that by thinking about the beginning. She met Mark by bumping into him at a wedding when he was arguing with a telephone psychic. So I think that's all you need to know. I'm going to get on with it. I spent my time getting drunk and investigating the cold spots in the house. I tried to clean the flat in preparation for Mavis's arrival. And each morning, I awoke to more mess than there had been the night before. In desperation, and wanting, I think, to make the flat into a place that we would feel welcoming to Mavis, I started Googling psychics again. I clicked through to the websites this time. Things had got that bad. I found out that the 3 Joyces who worked in Lancashire claimed to have skills in tarot, past life regression, and clairvoyance. There is a difference between a medium and a clairvoyant, apparently, although I didn't know what it was. I loaded the websites one by one and scoured them for clues, slightly shamefaced, even though I was alone. One of them had a photograph of herself sitting in a leather armchair with a cat on her knee. She was grey-haired and slim, wearing a heap of silver bangles on her wrists, and she was definitely not the Joyce I met at Sharon's wedding. The second had a website full of soft focus headshots that made her look more like a catalogue model than a serious professional, and she was too young and too short and too blonde. The third didn't have any pictures of herself on her site at all, so I gathered my courage, got through the first bottle of wine I'd been able to stomach since the previous day, and telephoned her. "Is this Joyce?" I asked, tentatively. "Sharon's Joyce, wedding Joyce, Mark and Laurie's Joyce," I wanted to say. Would I recognise Joyce's voice from a brief conversation at a wedding nearly 16 years ago? I did not trust myself to be sure. "It is I," she said. I was wondering if... "You have a question," she said. She'd answered the phone in a slightly distracted, everyday voice, and once she heard my faltering beginning, she switched to her at-work voice, a quieter, more portentous tone. "Obviously," I said, snippily, then regretted it. "Have you had a look at my website? Services and prices?" "Prices? I thought Joyce did the work as a kind of public service, a contribution to the common good. Perhaps she'd fallen on hard times. Perhaps I'd got the wrong Joyce. Would you like to book an appointment? I work during the day. I can do you over Skype, love. That's not a problem. The cyber realms are very hospitable to non-material beings, you know. If I ever told Eddie about this, he will never let me hear the end of it, I thought. I think I need my house clearing, cleansing, sorting out. My cheeks burned. I think it has a presence. I nodded, coughed. Yes, it's cold all the time. The doors open and close, stuff goes missing. That might be me mislaying things. I don't know, my voice cracked. Everything's gone wrong for me, I said pathetically. A presence maligning intent? I don't know. I imagined her nodding and making notes in a leather-bound volume, the phone tucked between her shoulder and her ear. Hard passing? What? The passing over. Sudden, painful. Sometimes they don't know they're in the wrong place, lovely. I can see you're a beginner at this. I don't know. I don't have that information. It was, now I come to think of it, just like that time I rang the Housing Association to ask them to send someone out to look at the electric heaters. Not having the vocabulary to describe what was wrong or know what to ask for, I struggled and lost my temper. It's not right in my house, in my flat, in my life, everything. It's all getting away from me. I sounded like a nutter. I knew I did, but then again, I wasn't the person charging money to talk to people's house spirits. So this Joyce, if she was going to judge me, did not have a leg to stand on, and the thought galvanised me. I'm not sure what services you offer to clean a place up. I looked around me. My efforts at sorting out the flat had been half-hearted and minimal. I needed Kim and Aggie more than I needed a psychic. All right, love. Sometimes it's a matter unresolved. Words left unsaid leaves a ripple in the veil between our place and theirs. Did that fit? I didn't want to tell her about Mark, about what had happened to us. I didn't want to tell her anything. I'd read about it, you see. The art of the cold reading. You shouldn't give them anything to go on. I decided to take control and ask the questions myself. Do they hang about? If they feel like wrong was done to them, do they hang about? I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. It's a great kind of taste of the spookiness of the novel. Okay, so Richard, could you read us
Yeah,
from the book, please?
Yeah, so I'll start a few chapters in, so I'll have to set the scene a little bit. So as Abby said, it's set on the northeast coast of England in the 1920s. The narrator is a naturalist called John Lowell. His wife Harriet is also a major character, and the scene I'm going to read follows the arrival in this village of an American, mysterious, enigmatic, charismatic American called Maurice Shakes and his two daughters. Now Jonathan and his old friend David have met the daughters in various ways by this point, and they've been sort of cornered by Maurice Shakes on a cliff overlooking the beach, and they've heard whispers, rumours about a dream that has brought this enigmatic man to the village, and this is the scene where Maurice Shakes expands somewhat upon his dream. The regrettable thing about this book is that there isn't a page in it that doesn't require me to do an accent. So I'm just going to go for it, and you will just have to, stomach it if you can. Okay. A foaming blue Atlantic, a robin's egg sky, a merry smell of fried food, the strident and quavering music of a barrel organ, laughter, sailors' songs, delighted screams from the daredevils riding on the Mangles machinery. It was easy to picture when one heard Maurice Shakes speak of it. We sat on the bluff, me and David and Shakes, in the teeth of the autumn easterly. Eleanor had been dispatched home to the terraced house that the family rented at the north extremity of the village. As the three of us talked, a bottle of rye whiskey, drawn with a wink from an inner pocket of Shakespeare's greatcoat, passed back and forth between us. And you propose to rebuild this paradise here at Gravely? I prompted. I do, gentlemen. Shakes nodded heavily, staring out across the bay. David laughed, emboldened by the rye. There had been no mention of Cordelia, of moonlit fornications in the sand. He felt safe, therefore. This is not Coney Island, Mr. Shakes, he said. Shakes grinned and swigged from the bottle. Once, Mr. McAllister, Coney Island was nothing but a Puritan's village and a stretch of barren beach, he chided gently. And I tell you so true, because I knew it then. And I know what it became, too. He nodded again and repeated the syllables as though they were sacred. Coney Island. This, to my surprise, was Shakespeare's dream. In my imaginings, he had come to Gravely to write a rollicking novel of seafarers, or perhaps to invest misguidedly in some new chop house, brewery, or railway enterprise. Not so. Instead, he had seen in his dream a pleasure ground, here on our remote and rocky shore. A pleasure ground, he had said, such as these storied ocean kingdoms have never known. I had told him that there was a rather grand pavilion at Brighton on the south coast, and that there were notable piers, much in use for promenading and such, at Blackpool, Hastings, and Cromer. He hadn't really responded. Instead, he had made a rumbling noise of assent in the back of his throat, and murmured, a pier, yes, there will be, sir, a pier. Across the bay, the harbour looked ever more fragile. A light burned aboard a moored trawler, for dusk was gathering, and it seemed to me a flame preserved in cupped hands. Something, perhaps the raw rye whiskey, made me ask, your daughter, Miss Shakes, Eleanor, mentioned a younger brother. Shakes frowned. Yes, he said, a brother, a younger brother. He looked sideways at me, I sat to his left, and his eyes widened in a momentary show of anger. My excuse, sir. In my daughter's eyes, the gallant death of Lawrence Shakes is my excuse for behaving as monstrously, as irreligiously as I am known to do. I'm sorry, I muttered, to have spoken of it. My displeasure is not with you, Shakes said, and you shouldn't be sorry to speak of my brother, Mr. Lowell, for in spite of everything, he was a gentle and kind man. He smiled down at the mouth of the whiskey bottle. I'd be glad, by God, I'd be proud to tell you of him. Only I'm afraid, sirs, I've already wasted enough of your time. Our time, said the courtly David McAllister, seems a fair exchange for your good whiskey. Shakes laughed and said, this isn't any good whiskey. He took another mouthful, wiped his mouth on his cuff, and sighing, passed the bottle back to me. The war took Lawrence, he said. I glanced across at David. Not only Lawrence Shakes, but George McAllister, David's father, too, plus the many thousands besides. David only said, it took such a lot. Indeed, sir. I'm sure you fellows, too, suffered greatly in that forsaken time. The war told a million sad stories. But Lawrence's story, the story, of me and Lawrence, the story that ended with my brother dead in a Montfaucon ditch, that story began a little way before, when in the springtime of 1914, Lawrence met a girl named Grace Durbin. Another marriage, suggested David, sundered by the conflict. Shakes shook his head. Not quite. My own parents' marriage survived the war, but not the peace. My mother died in the autumn of 1918 from the Spanish influenza. I was 12. I remember her perfectly well, of course. A busy, fretful, nervous woman, lean-bodied with a frizz of brown hair and dark pink hands. But the picture of her that predominates in my mind was taken a year before I was born. It is of my parents on their wedding day. They stand side by side, arm in arm, awkward and unsmiling in the light of the brand new century. My veiled mother looked terribly young. In my father's face, I see my own face. Lawrence and Grace were never married, Shakes said. They were engaged, it's true, properly, formally, with all appropriate consent and what have you. They were never married. The war intervened, I suppose, I said. Not quite, Shakes said. Slowly, stupidly, I began to understand that this was not a story about the war.
Oh, I love that bit, and I was completely mesmerised. Thank you so much. Yes, round of applause. It's just such well-written books, very, very different, but so well-written, and I was really impressed with just the writing of both of them. So I've got some questions, and that I don't want to sort of dictate too much how the conversation goes, but they're questions that are kind of for both of you, that you can interpret how you want to and kind of chip in how you want to. I want to start with one that kicks off from Richard's work, but will also apply to Jen. So you've written quite a lot of non-fiction,
That's right.
Extensively written non-fiction, and a lot of it's nature and landscape related. And there must be a lot of research that goes into both a book like this, which is historical and about nature, and your non-fiction. What are the differences between compiling a book like this, producing a book like this, and producing a non-fiction book? And how do you sort of decide this feels like it needs to be fiction and this feels like it needs to be non-fiction?
Well, this is where as a novelist I start to look like a fraud next to Jen, because I know she's her research is amazing, and mine isn't. I think the main difference for me is that in non-fiction the research drives the work, and in fiction the stories drive the research. And I think in writing fiction, I think the really important thing to remember as a writer is that you're in charge, that the fiction is in charge, that the made up stuff is in charge, and the made up stuff is what matters, and that the everything else is a resource for you to use to that end. And so, I mean, the research, there has been some crossover, certainly. My short fiction particularly tends to be, a lot of the ideas for that arise from research and doing further stuff, or from my general work. As you mentioned, I do weird jobs like crosswords and quiz questions, which involves a lot of quite random reading. So a lot of that informs the fiction. It all, it all just goes into the compost heap, so to speak, and comes out as mulch. In terms of doing the research for a novel like this, I do try to make it as authentic as I can. But I think it's quite important to remember that everything that is in a novel is on the page. And I could put it like this, that I think if you do a good enough job of portraying the tip of the iceberg, people will assume the rest of the iceberg is there. In terms of your knowledge and your research, even if it's not. There's an old joke, Groucho Marx joke. The key to success is sincerity. If you can fake that, you've got it made. And I would slightly tweak that and say authenticity is sometimes an impression you give, because it's easy to get too caught up and worry about and forget that fiction is about manipulation and telling lies in search of, in pursuit of hopefully greater truths. But it's about manipulating and controlling the reader. And I think for me, the deployment of research to give a certain impression or to give a certain perspective is part of that. But Jen is a much better researcher than I am.
And I felt with this novel as well, Richard, that it is so much about characters, isn't it, as well? So the details of the period and the setting are really sort of about bringing those characters. Yeah,
for me, I mean, the voice particularly is really important to me. And obviously, with it being first person, most of my stuff, probably about 80% of my fiction is first person. And that's partly because voice is such an important component of it for me. Often the voice emerges first, and it'll be a case of what story can I tell with this voice?
Yes.
And the other character's voice is slightly less important, but still that often leads the way. And the historical stuff, again, it's a question of what I want to do, the stories I want to make up, and the stories I want to tell, and the things I want to think and write about. All the rest of it is a way of bending the world to my needs in that sense, if you see what I mean. All the research, the historical stuff, all the context, that's all put to use for me. And as you said, to serve character, to serve voice and story.
I did have let me see what I was going to ask Jen in relation to this. So Jen, I have also read Notes Made While Falling, which I found it very moving and a really interesting kind of, well, for want of a better word, it feels like a kind of hybrid piece of work, I suppose, in terms of its sort of non-fiction approach. And as Richard said, there's a lot of material that you've researched for Notes Made While Falling, but it's got a very personal eye. And with Ghosted, I felt that Notes Made While Falling is a book about trauma in many respects, and with Ghosted, I felt like it's a book about trauma very much as well, amongst other themes. But they deal with that trauma in really different ways, those different kinds of traumas in different ways. So do you think, what does fiction offer you in terms of exploring trauma that non-fiction maybe doesn't? Or, how do those two different genres offer you ways of exploring trauma, I suppose, is my question. Sorry, it's a very convoluted question.
Yeah, I guess I wrote Notes Made While Falling from the rubble of lots of failed fictions that were attempts to hold that material. There were short stories, there was a novel. You can still see the relics of it. One of the chapters is it's called A Lecture on Influence, and it's set out as a lecturer opining about creative writing, and that was originally a short story where there was a woman who was a creative writing lecturer, as I am, and she would get to the lectern and she was supposed to give her students some advice and wisdom, and instead treated it a bit like kind of group therapy and just talked about her problems for an hour, made the students listen to it, and there were all kinds of reasons why fiction was not doing the thing I wanted it to do for the particular experience that I was having and that I wanted to explore. And the book does kind of explore why that might be. And yeah, I call it a memoir in essays because it does bear the relic of fiction. There are some times where I rewrite bits of Dracula in order to try and get at something about my experience, or I take a short story that I have already published and it was very autobiographical, the short story, and I try and mash it up and measure it against reality. So yes, it is very, very hybrid, and some of the things that book is interested in are not only questions about me and my experience, but questions about the novel, about fiction, about plot, about epiphanies, and yes, about trauma. And those questions are addressed in a much more maybe literary critical or kind of researched mode. And that was the book that it needed to be. And I did write it in the expectation that I was kind of giving up on fiction, that I couldn't make fiction do what I wanted to do. So imagine my surprise when then I accidentally wrote a novel. And I guess what was the novel, it does tread some similar ground. It is about loss, it is about trauma. The novel is not autobiographical, but I did give some of my emotional experiences to some of my characters, not all of them to Laurie. I did give some of my pet research obsessions to both Laurie and Mark. I was nodding away, listening to Richard speaking about research and the fiction and the characters have to lead the research, that the story needs to make use of the research rather than be there in order to display it or essay it towards the reader. And I guess that's what Ghosted allowed me to do. I did so much research for Ghosted. Mark's job is as a security guard at a nuclear power station, and I went and had a tour of one and got to see the reactor, and did loads of reading about you know, how they get the uranium in and out of there, and none of it was needed for the book. I like went to see a psychic night at a club, and it wasn't needed for the book. And I did loads of really serious research into the police procedure when people go missing, and the kind of sociological phenomena of men in particular going missing, and men struggling with mental ill health. And I really like the word that Richard used, like compost. It was like I put all this stuff in my head and then forgot about it. And from it, the novel grew. So I guess what the novel let me do that Notes never did was completely forget myself as a researcher, and just pretend to be Laurie and Mark and all those other people for a while. There was such a pleasure in it, and I can't say that writing Notes was as much fun.
Thank you. That's really interesting to hear that the research has to be done, and has to be done in a lot of detail, but it won't all find itself in an obvious way.
No.
Yeah.
I think sometimes I'm a novelist because it is my alibi for being interested in a really prurient way in stuff that's none of my business.
Thank you, that's brilliant. So I mentioned earlier on about characterization, which I was really struck by. I particularly like the moment we kind of introduced to Morris. Is that Brody, Jen?
Famous Brody.
Famous Brody, gate crashing.
I just muted myself because he's getting a bit growly, so sorry. I'm going to try and treat the occasion with the dignity it deserves, but he probably isn't.
Has he had a wash for the occasion? He looks very fluffy.
He is looking good, isn't he?
I follow Jen's Instagram, so I do see quite a lot of Brody. sorry, okay. So Morris Shapes. The first real introduction we get to him is where he tells this story about the whale.
Yeah.
And I've always loved the biblical story of Jonah and the whale because it's so horrible and weird.
Yeah.
And I love the way that he kind of comes in on that and says, no, this is what it's like. And it seems to me that his characterization is a lot about storytelling.
Yeah.
A lot of his personality comes from stories that he tells, narratives that he tells. But no, anyway, just generally, I felt as though the characters in your novel were so kind of vivid and so realistic and so well drawn. The same with Jen, and Jen, you've said a little bit about your characters already, but I was thinking about things like dialogue in particular. In both the novels, the dialogue's incredibly strong and convincing. I didn't ever feel there was a moment where I didn't feel like I was listening to people talking. They're very, very different in terms of tone and obviously the time that they're set in. But the dialogue in both novels felt really strong to me, the sort of banter and the tone of them. A lot of students of our courses here at York St John, I know some of you here will be students, say to me that dialogue is the most difficult thing to get right. So the characterization in terms of appearance and description and setting, they enjoy. Dialogue, you might find this with your students as well, Jen. Dialogue, they say, is so difficult that sometimes they even avoid doing it. And I just wondered if either of you had techniques or tips or ways in which you develop your dialogue from your characters and things that you do to create that feeling of reality in your dialogue. Yeah, Rich, do you want to start?
To be honest, I find it hard to identify with that, finding it that difficult, because I find it something where I can almost rattle on non-stop once you get into the flow of it. I think I hear very clearly in my head. I don't know if this is one of the things about writing, because there's been quite a lot of discussion over the last few years about what exactly people have in their heads in general life and also when writing, and whether people have mental pictures of things, whether people have an inner voice, whether people are able to what extent you literally hear a voice, to what extent purely abstract, and the various gradations in between. So it's really difficult, I think, when you're trying to talk to people about creative writing, to know what, if you're on the same, you know, in the same place, because dialogue, I can hear it, and if it sounds, I mean, I'm not saying I'm amazing at dialogue, but I just think if it comes in my head, and I can hear the words being spoken.
Yeah.
If it sounds false, I think I'll hopefully, you can tell it just means.
So you sort of imagine that you're listening to that conversation, and
yeah, I kind of have to imagine it just sort of happens, and this is the thing that I often have to rein myself in, because you just get into the conversation, you forget that it's serving the novel,
yes,
and you've got each voice down, so to speak, and you're just doing it. It's just two people talking, and you're sort of, I'm not going to say you're transcribing because it's not quite that dissociative, but it just rattles out quite comfortably. A structure is much more difficult for me. The picturing, both visual pictures and the speech and the oral elements, they're just sort of there. Because I had terrible difficulty when I was redrafting, because I had a very clear picture of where a certain scene happens. It's a boxing match, a bare knuckle boxing match that happens near the harbour. And I had a very clear picture of where it happened, but perhaps not a very good knowledge of how everything fit together. And the copywriters the copy editors kept getting back to me saying, okay, how did they get from here to here? And I said, oh God, I was drawing maps and I couldn't do that. It was awful. It took me about 5 goes to redraft this scene where it actually made geographical sense, but I saw it as clear as day in my head. And you know, it's the same with voices for me. I'm sitting here saying I hear voices now. But I think if it flows, it just flows for me. So I'm afraid it's difficult for me to address the question of it not flowing.
Did you have to moderate the voices to make? It's difficult, isn't it, this one, because people in the 1920s, yes. I felt there was a really subtle sense of, particularly our sort of main narrator, if you like, you wouldn't speak like that today.
Oh, no.
And how did was that part of researching how people would speak in the 20s, what kind of phrasing they would use? I tend to rely sort of on osmosis to do that. I just read around the period, right? Okay. Non-fiction, fiction, whatever, and you just get an idea of it. Also, I was trying to slightly undercut the traditions or the preconceptions of historical fiction, partly in the language, partly in just the general attitudes to stuff like sex, because I think we have people. There's this slightly stagey element to the way in which people behave in historical fiction on the page and on the screen or whatever. For instance, people never speak with contractions, particularly in period dramas. Does my head in. They never say, surely people were saying can't and don't and won't before us, but anyone before 1950 told us I cannot, I do not. Anyway. So I was trying to introduce what felt like a more natural element to me. Yes. At the same time, quite a few of these characters are monstrous sort of ham actors who tend to vent forth every now and again. So that was an opportunity to be a bit more stagey, I suppose. And how about you, Jen? Because I noticed Laurie has these very, very specific relationships with different characters, and she speaks in a subtly different way to each one. Actually, she has a different dynamic with each one. So, do you struggle with dialogue, or do you find it comes naturally, or what?
Yeah, I love writing dialogue, and I do the dialogue first, like down the page. I don't write, the scene as it comes. I write in layers, and I always do the dialogue first. And I hear it. I do think that quite a lot of writing for me is a kind of practice of listening, both kind of listening to the characters, and then as I edit, listening to the draft and trying to figure out what it wants to be or what it needs me to go and research. And you mentioned about writing students, and I guess the thing that I go back to here is that really famous quotation from Aristotle's Poetics, where he says plot is character in action, like people doing stuff. And the stuff that I am most interested in people doing is talking and remembering. And the reason why is that when people talk, they're in relationship with other people. There's always some kind of power struggle, and people never say what they mean. And when they're remembering, they're in some kind of power struggle with their past. So both of those actions have inherent conflicts in them. The plot just happens. You don't need to think about a story. You just have to get a person talking or remembering. And I guess what helps me develop voice is to realise that talking never happened. Maybe it sometimes happens in a vacuum. We talk to ourselves or we soliloquise in front of the bathroom mirror, but most of the time talking happens in a context, and it is totally shaped by who you think you're talking to, what you want that person to think of you, why you're trying to manipulate them, or what you're trying to get out of this interaction. Who is allowed to interrupt, who is allowed to lie, who is allowed to stonewall. Figuring all that stuff out is sort of like why I love writing and people watching and teaching as well. Yeah, it's really, really, really important. And I guess the idea of the speech is it's so important in Richard's books. The sermon, the speech for a purpose. And I guess what I also try and remind my students and myself as I'm writing is that generally when people talk, they have an intention to affect some kind of change. And whether that is to convert someone to a religious belief or to sell them an idea, as happens so often in Richard's book, or to get away with something that you kind of shouldn't have done, as happens so much in my book. I think if you figure out what the change the speaker wants to achieve, that really helps as well.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And the idea of conformity of the speech.
Well, what I think Jenn does amazingly in Ghosted is the voice is so human, and because this is for me one of the great important things in fiction, is a human turn to your voice. It's a human, it's a natural, it comes out so just funny, it's real, and yet it has this element of unreliability. I'm not going to give much away, but there's a lot that's not disclosed and there's a lot that's held back, which I think is a real achievement when you're writing in a voice that's as fluent, because what the woodcut lets me do to some extent, the fact that it's got a period setting, the fact that some characters are have this slightly orotund rhetorical mode of speech, and there's concealments in there as well, but it's perhaps a little bit easier. And there's also the question of one of the sort of co-narrator, slightly subsidiary narrator is Harriet, John's wife. Her role, being a woman in the 1920s, is slightly subsidiary, and so that again, let me do the concealment. Let me keep things from the reader. So I think one of the real achievements of Ghosted is having that really human voice that is still not telling you everything. You feel like it's been frank and open with you, but there's that layer beneath it. I think that's one of the amazing things about the book.
I think when you're writing in the first person or you're doing dialogue, like the trick is the same, isn't it, Richard? It's not only figuring out what they're saying, but figuring out what they're not going to say at any given point. Like, not all narrators want to deliberately and directly deceive the reader, but each instance of narration or of speech or of dialogue is a choice. There are loads of possible things that person could have said in that moment, and they've chosen to say one thing and to not say a load of other things. And it's like what you said earlier about the iceberg. Like, we just need to hint or allow the reader to imagine that there were loads of other possible things that could have been said in that moment. And I think that is what, when I'm reading and I think the characters are really human, it's because I feel like they're three-dimensional, that I could peek around the sides of the page. And I think that effect is conveyed by giving the impression there were other things that it is possible that they could have said in that moment.
I mean, the thing, when I did do because I put initially wrote this one without, Harriet has alternate chapters to John, but hers are a bit shorter, and hers are much more of a inner monologue, really. And I originally wrote it without that, and the inclusion of them was partly the result that one of the early readers said they just wanted more Harriet, which was nice, but partly it was just me cracking under that pressure of knowing that she was there as the most perceptive character in the book, the most wise character in the book, really, surrounded by all these showboating men. And while I tried in the original draft to get that across, I did feel that sort of pressure, and like I can't bear for Harriet to not be seen as this character that she really is. And so I don't know if that was a weakness or not, but so I gave her own voice and put her in and let the reader see a little bit of that, which I was quite pleased with how that came out.
I was going to ask about that because I really loved the inclusion of her voice and the fact that it sort of undercuts everything, and it creates this lovely kind of tension.
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting.
I mean, it's always interesting to read what people find in your fiction, you know, that you didn't see is there. And I don't know how much to give away of the plot, but let's just say John, who's married to Harriet, there were moves towards a romantic entanglement elsewhere. And there's a part of me, when I was writing it, was thinking, oh, this is quite, because I'm a child, was thinking, oh, this is quite beautiful, and you know, is he falling in love with this other woman, and is this going to be a romantic thing? But the better part of me was thinking, grow up, you brat. You know, and you know, Harriet is your wife, and she's wonderful, and that's what most readers who I've spoken to about this say. You know, John's it's painful to watch him being a dickhead. Yeah.
We've been talking for a while, so I've had lots of my questions answered. So I thought I might open it to you guys to see if you've got any questions. Oh, there's a question straight away. Okay, brilliant. Yes.
I find when I'm writing, quite by accident, aspects of me end up within a character. And it's often a character I don't want it to end up in. Do you guys find that? Do you find that kind of like aspects of yourself, especially like aspects that you are not impressed by, end up in the characters?
Yeah, well, they're all you, I'm afraid. They all come from you, and you can't get away from that. It's all things you've thought, even if it's repellent. And I wouldn't say, I mean, it's not, for me anyway, it's not a sort of therapy or anything, but it's, why not use it? You know, why not? You know, your novel is a safe space. You can express yourself freely. So yeah, absolutely. Anything that's come into my head will probably end up on a page, and doesn't mean you endorse it or anything, and you don't have to. It's, you know, it's a nice way of confronting it. Really, it's a nice way of addressing it, even just within the safety of your own head and your own word processor. Yeah, that's absolutely the case. It's yeah, I couldn't write without that.
Jen, did you hear that question?
I did. I heard it really well. Thank you. And I just wanted to say I can't see the person who asked the question. So if it looks like I'm gazing moronically into space, it's Zoom, not me. But yeah, I guess, you know, my novels are not autobiographical, and fiction is autobiographical in that it is always a record of what the novelist was thinking and doing, and what the novelist cared about during the time that the book was written. So that is a kind of quite mealy-mouthed way of answering that question, and there may be more direct way of answering that question, is that I feel I have a very kind of warm, compassionate relationship with my characters, especially the characters that behave really poorly, and generally it's because if they have traits that make them difficult to live with, I know about these traits through experience. I was doing a Zoom yesterday, and one of the people who read Ghosted said they picked out a moment where Laurie is in the hospital visiting her father, who is extremely ill. It's quite a difficult part of the book. She's with Olenna, who is her father's carer, and she's just been horrible to Olenna and basically accused her of trying to like kill him and steal his money. And Olenna is there with her, and Olenna is so shocked by the state that Gerald, the dad, is in, that she says, I'm going to stop smoking. It's too much. I'm going to turn over a new leaf with my health. And in the midst of that, Laurie thinks, oh, I wonder if I could have her fags if she doesn't want them anymore. And the reader kind of picked that out as a moment of exemplary of Laurie's selfishness and self-absorption. And yeah, it kind of is. And also, I gave her that thought, you know, that was what occurred to me when I approached that scene. So even when writing is not autobiographical, you can feel a little bit defensive of your characters in their worst moments because you imagine them for them.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I'll ask about first chapters. Whether you put more work into the first chapter or how you approach the first chapter.
So William's asking, did you hear that, Jen?
No.
So William's asking about first chapters and whether what a sort of disproportionate amount of work goes into a first chapter and how important they are.
I guess I can't answer generally because all the books have been written differently. But for Ghosted, I was at an Arvon house, and I was it was towards the process when we were finding a publisher for Notes Made While Falling, and I was speaking to someone at the Arvon house and saying I don't think I want to write novels anymore. I'm sort of over it. And she said these weren't the exact words, but the dramatic function of what she said was, shut up, stop whinging, get on with your work. And I went to my little room in the Arvon house and I wrote the first 5 pages of Ghosted, and it's pretty much as you read it. And that first 5 pages where Laurie speaks directly to the reader and she says, I want to tell you about the last day that I saw my husband. I was very angry at him and I didn't tell the police that. And I also didn't report him missing straight away, and I'm not going to tell you why. She set up these 2 lies, one of which she was going to tell us about and one of which she wouldn't tell us about. And that I didn't know anything else. I didn't know where he'd gone, why she was lying, what the backstory was. And that first chapter became a kind of, you know, like Mary Poppins' carpet bag, where she kind of opens it and everything else comes out, the lamp and the plant and the mirror and all sorts. I just kept going to that chapter and finding things that were interesting about Laurie or her situation or her marriage, and writing a scene that answered a question that first chapter had invited me to ask. It doesn't always work like that, but that's how it was for Ghosted. I need to invite that person from the Arvon course to come and live in my house and give me another stern talk quite soon, I think.
I think the first chapter question is particularly relevant when you're trying to get published, because I mean I write like an absolute freak. I write in a completely linear way. I start at the first page and finish on the last page, and then it doesn't change much if I'm allowed to have my way between then and publication. But agents and publishers want the first chapter or the first 3 chapters in your synopsis or whatever. And that's when you start to worry and you think, well, do I need to pack all the good stuff into these first 3 chapters? Because that's what, you know, people are going to read and judge the book on. And I absolutely didn't do that. And the first chapter here is the first scene I wrote. It always is, or nearly always is. Sometimes I forget what I'm like and I go back a few years later and look at something between publication and first draft. I think, oh, I wonder what interesting changes took place, and it's just exactly the same. Nothing interesting developed between first and last draft. Just some typos. The first chapter just, it's you feeling your way into it. I mean, there's a couple of times I've removed one editor called scaffolding, which you construct in the early stages and then isn't needed once the novel stands by itself. Once or twice I've reluctantly done that. But I mean, I've no idea really where the idea for this came from. It came with Mr. Shakes, and I think up here. I think I wanted to write something on the East Coast, definitely, because I love it. But as always, I look back and I just think, how did this happen? I do remember it was supposed to be like a boisterous knockabout historical sort of comic thing, and then, as always, it just ended up not being that. It ended up taking a darker turn. So yeah, for me, the first chapter is just how the story emerges, but it is so difficult when you're trying to think of it as something to sell and market. I honestly don't know what the answer is to that. You'd have to ask an agent or a publisher, because I do think it's an important question.
Thank you. Great question. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, sorry.
It's all right.
You say you write in kind of like a linear fashion,
Yeah.
and the idea of scaffolding is very interesting to me because I can't write in a linear fashion.
Oh, really?
But every single chapter is just scaffolding in there. And I wondered, do you see much dissonance between the first kind of draft that you do and then obviously the final draft? Do you have that? Because I know with mine, I do all the big things and then I have to do the filler in between. Do you guys kind of suffer with that thing of like the need for filler amongst the scaffolding, or how do you how's your writing kind of progressing? Is that
for me, because plot tends to be fairly secondary for me. I don't think like that, because I just tend to let the voice and characters go more or less where they want, as long as they work their way towards where I roughly want to be. I'm okay. So I don't really have big plot points that I need to work between. If I do, it can get quite tiresome. If I feel there's a scene 2 chapters away and I just want to get there, yeah, I know what you mean. But mainly, I think you've got to be interested. You've got to really try and avoid, if you're getting bored writing it, I guess you've got to think, well, why? I say, why isn't every scene, why isn't every page exciting to write? And of course, it won't always be. I know sometimes it's going to be drudge work, but yeah, for me, I think not thinking about plot makes it easier to concentrate on what's happening on the page, what the voice is doing, what the characters are doing. Is a more productive way for me to have momentum rather than slugging my way towards the next set piece.
So Jen, that was a question
Sorry.
about no, just in case you didn't hear, but that was a question about structure and scaffolding, and you've already said, out of your first chapter kind of came the rest of it like a carpet bag, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, that's what happened with Ghosted, and I wrote it more or less in the order that it appears, and the help that I needed in the edit was primarily to do with the timelines. It was quite important that Mark was away for a certain amount of time and came back at a certain time, and that there was all these kinds of it was quite closely mapped onto the year. And I really messed it up in 4 or 5 places, and I couldn't see it. And even after my editor was kind of helping me out, I needed a diagram drawn, because my interest was so much in the minutiae of, what was Laurie thinking at this moment. I needed someone to be that big a pair of eyes. And quite often, what's more usual for me is that I don't write with any sense of order. I have to show you, I'm trying to write a novel at the moment, and this is what it looks like. And I've got a kind of tidal wave of post-it notes with kind of angry remarks written on them, and they're on the edge of my desk, and they are kind of mounting up. There's no sense that they're in any kind of order. And I guess when I'm ready to start writing, I'm going to pick a post-it and write that scene. And if the post-it, if I pick it and it feels boring, then I'll probably throw it away. And the sense that the scenes come in a certain order will not be clear to me. That's my normal process for a really long time. I'm really interested in the metaphors that writers use to describe their process, and this idea of scaffolding is one that I've heard before. For me, I don't so much feel like I'm erecting a building, and more like I'm digging a hole. And I find a lump of clay, and it is, I don't know if clay is found like that actually, but let's just say it is. And I find a lump of clay, and it's dirty and it doesn't look like anything, and that is the first draft. And so the edit is the actual writing, where I turn the clay into something like a novel. And post-its are involved.
Thank you. So quite a messy, chaotic business.
Yeah.
Not driven by the scaffolding, by the sound of it, for these 2 writers. There you go.
I think if there was an anxiety underneath that question, I didn't hear it, but I sensed there was maybe an anxiety, and my suggestion would be that what's special about novels is that they're really big, which means that you've kind of got to tolerate it being a dog's dinner for about 3 years, maybe longer. And that doesn't mean that it's a bad novel or that you're a bad writer. It's just going to be a horrible mess for a really long time. And if there are things that you can do to help you hold your nerve, sometimes those are writers groups or other people reading it, and sometimes it's eating loads of sweets. Do those things, I would say.
Brilliant, thank you. Maybe one more question. Yes.
Do you have like particular writing routines or ways that you approach your writing? Like, are you quite structured and diligent, or I'm just interested in the different ways.
Jen?
Do you know, I have this fantasy that I would like to be the kind of writer who has got a regular practice, and I've experimented with trying to develop one in lots and lots of different ways. Like, if I could be a night owl and always be at my desk at 10, or if I could get up and like drink hot water and lemon and do loads of press-ups and then write 1,000 words, or if, you know, kind of whatever it was, I would like it to be regular, I would like it to be predictable, I would like to know that tomorrow my writing practice is going to look like this. And the fantasy of that for me is about denying what is true for me as a writer, which is that it is chaotic and messy and quite often frightening in some ways, and that I don't really, I can control technique and I can learn how to deploy technique better, but when it comes to having an idea or feeling a connection to a project or a character, I haven't figured out a way to be in charge of that. So my practice is characterized by periods of extreme regularity. I do a project called 100 Days of Writing once a year or so, where I will write every day for 100 days, not to produce lots of work, but to observe my practice and get to know it. And also there will be lots of times where I don't write, or where I sort of whinge about writing and kind of wander around in a dressing gown eating crisps. And I would like it to be a bit more tidy, and I haven't managed to make that happen.
And you can join Jen with her 100 Days of Writing.
I've not sold it really, have I?
Well, the crisps have sold me.
Always crisps, sweets, tangerines, whatever you want.
I've got a weakness for Skittles, Jen. It's like terrible. They're like crack. And I think I blame my children for keeping me awake at night. But if I've got a little bowl of Skittles, and I'm like, yeah, I'm on fire. But Jen does do 100 Days of Writing every year, and people join her, and it's really good. I try to do it, Jen, but I do like a completely different 100 days to the 100 days that you do, so that's why I don't. But I should try to join yours, because the solidarity of that is really cool. So
the company is nice, yeah. And what I guess, you know, what was really great about it was learning from other writers who were answering this question as Richard is about to, you know, that how do you do it? What do the nuts and bolts look like? There's a kind of mystery around writing, and there's so much nonsense as well. Like, I don't know, when I was younger, I imagined that I'd have a garret and a typewriter and like Lucky Strike and some whiskey and somehow be a man with a beard and and you know, so much stereotype around who is allowed to be a writer and what writing should look like. And you know, the reality is sometimes you sat in your car waiting for the kids to come out for swimming lessons, and you write something bad on your phone for 20 minutes, and that does.
Brilliant. How about you then? Crisps and dressing gowns?
Sherbet lemons are my weakness. Yeah, I'm quite boring in most ways. Well, since I've been living with my partner, my wife now, I've kept fairly regular hours, and I've got kids now, so even more circumscribed. But I've always, even when I was living by myself and, you know, attempting to be a bohemian, I've done all my writing at my computer on the word processor. I don't have notebooks, don't for fiction certainly. I don't have notebooks, don't have anything like that. But that's not to downplay the extent to which the work gets done at other times, because this is the thing about the composting process. It all happens whether you know it or not. So in terms of actually getting stuff down on the page, I do it. I'm a freelancer, so my life is just chaos in terms of my work. I just, I've got 10 things on at once, and fiction fits in around that. I think what's a really important thing is the distinction between writing when you've got a publisher or an agent, someone waiting for your draft, a deadline, and writing like most of us do most of the time when nobody cares whether you write it or not. That's the really hard thing. And so particularly if you're someone like me who, you do paid work or you don't get paid, if you know what I mean, setting aside time to write something that has no guarantee of any return of any kind can be really hard. And I think that's often underplayed because it's a sacrifice. It sounds a bit dramatic, but what is not the hardest of working lives, but it is a sacrifice. And so I think when you've got a deadline, it can be easier. When I did a few years ago now, I'm very proud that I wrote 2 crime thrillers for money under the name Jackson Sharp. And one was a Halloween one, which you should all buy now since Halloween, called Trick or Treat. It's about a trick or treat murderer, and one was a Christmas one called The 12 Deaths of Christmas. All still available. But anyway, I wrote those on an incredibly short turnaround for Penguin. It came quite out of the blue, not the sort of job that normally comes my way. And I could do 10,000 words a day at a push on that, just because I had a deadline and I had money coming in. And it's quite freeing because it wasn't, my personal, I wasn't that attached to it personally, so I could just sort of hammer it out. And that's such a country, that was proper, at your desk. Anthony Trollope used to do this, and people think highly of him. He caused quite a stir, I believe, by saying that he just destroying the whole romantic stereotype of the novelist by saying, I sit at my desk, sit at my typewriter, and I write these huge novels, just as in order to a deadline and so on. So when we talk about how we do the writing, well, there's so many ways of doing it. So much of it depends on really boring things like that.
Brilliant, thank you. What a generous insight into the processes of both of these writers. I hope you're going to take some tips. Could we perhaps have a really short extract from both of you just to finish off? So perhaps starting this time with you,
Yeah,
Richard,
of course, yeah.
and then going to Jen, just to bookend.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll see how long is this. Yeah, that's not too long. Another accent with this one. So apologies to any northeasterners in the room. So this is from halfway through, but you don't need too much context except that this is one of Harriet's chapters. So this is narrated by Harriet, John's wife, and it's her in conversation with her old school friend who had a baby fairly recently, and they're in the kitchen preparing Sunday lunch. They say we need to restore the population, says Louisa, white-tipped pink elbow going like the clappers as she whisks the pudding batter. I mean, that's not why we had Michael. I know why you had Michael, I say, and nudge her. I know when his birthday is, and I know when their wedding day was, and I might not be Dr. Einstein, but there's some sums I can do. She gives me the saucer eyes and then giggles, wipes a floury spot of batter from her chin. Oh, shush you. I mean, we would have had a little one at some point, but with what they say about, the population, well, you feel like you don't laugh, sets down the cake to whiskey. But you feel sort of like you're doing your duty. I do laugh. I can't help laughing at Louisa sometimes. I'm not being mean. That's what your school friends are for. Funny sort of duty. I don't mean that, you. I mean, well, you've not had to do it yet, but it's blooming horrible, Harriet. All the blood and everything. And when you're growing up, you think of all the things the men had to go through over there back then, and you think, what can we do to do our bit? And that's a thing you can do. Have a baby. That yet. You've not had to do it yet. Lou said it as unselfconsciously as you like, while bent double at the oven door and swirling the fat in the tin. Never occurred to her that I might never have to do it, that it might never happen. It's a good thing in her, I think. Call her a Pollyanna if you want, but I shan't. It's just hope, isn't it? A thick, pea-soupy sort of hope that you can't see through, can't see beyond, but still hope. The hope I have, and I have plenty, mind, isn't like that. I can see through it to the other side. And if I wanted, I could poke my finger through it like through wet paper. I think if people had been a bit less concerned about duty, I say, we wouldn't have a population problem to worry about. He doesn't really hear, concentrating on jug and tin. The gravel beach raw as the batter meets the fat.
Really good, thank you so much. And Jen, if you could finish us off with an extract too, that would be brilliant.
Yeah. So one of the things that Laurie does while Mark is away is comb her memory for where things might have gone wrong between them. And she often kind of alights on things that they argued about. And these arguments are both not the reason that Mark left and also a window into how things were between them. Let's take the matter of the colander, Laurie says. We had 2 colanders, a plastic one with a long handle like a saucepan and a metal one with 2 small looped handles on either edge. And I didn't like using the metal one for actually draining things because the handles were so close to the bowl of the colander itself, I was worried about burning my fingers. Instead, I used it to steam vegetables by putting it on top of a pan of boiling water. It worked really well, and because of this, I kept it in the drawer while we kept the rest of the metal pans. Mark, who didn't mind the boiling water splashing at him when he was draining things, found it totally incomprehensible that we'd have 2 colanders in our tiny kitchen. My position was that he didn't need to comprehend it. He just needed to accept that I saw things differently. I was allowed a say in what objects we had in the kitchen, and he wasn't always going to get his own way. In our good times, the long entrenched disagreement just expressed itself through his insisting on putting the metal colander with the plastic one in the high up cupboard, so that when I looked for it in the pan drawer, I was not able to find it. But as we moved into our bad time, when he spent his evenings in front of his laptop and I spent mine in the room next door, watching his internet activity appear on the screen of my mobile phone and pretending to read Rebecca, this little colander-shaped flaw in the weave of our shared life started to unravel. Can't you just put it in the top cupboard? It doesn't fit in the drawer. It's fine in the drawer. It's a pain to get it out of the top cupboard. It's only a pain because we've got too much stuff. We need to have a sort out. You say that like it's a fact. Your opinion is that we have too much stuff. My opinion is that we don't. Why should yours count for more than mine? For God's sake, Laurie, look at the cupboards. I use them for different things, I said. I can't believe we keep having to have this conversation. Our voices were raised now, mine first. I will admit that. They're the same, they're exactly the same thing. Is this just about you having to get your own way? Do you want me to burn my hands when I drain the pasta? Is that it? Is there some sick bit of you that wants to punish me? I was out of the bed now, standing there with my hands on my hips. It is hard to argue with dignity when you are undressed. And so I turned my back to him, retrieved my dressing gown from the dirty clothes chair and put it back on. You're being ridiculous. That's how it always is, isn't it? I want something, it's stupid. I feel something, it's ridiculous. Laurie, I'm serious. Look at yourself. For the sake of a bit of cupboard space, you want me to burn my hand every time I cook for you. Is that what this is really about? I think it is, isn't it? You won't admit it to yourself. You really can't stand me, can you? I'll stop there. I guess if I were to read on, there would be a lesson in that when you are having an argument with your wife, never, ever use the word hysterical.
It's very dramatic. I just want you all to join me in thanking both Jen and Richard for very generously sharing their process, sharing some lovely, brilliant extracts from both their wonderful books. And it's been really nice to see some people in person at a writing event. We haven't done that very much lately. There are books to buy outside as well, so I would encourage you to have a look at the book stand outside. And just one more big round of applause for Jenn and Richard for joining us.
Sorry about the books. Everyone wants a signed, dedicated copy of Ghosted by Jen. She is going to sign book plates, so we will be able to sort that out for you. Just talk to Ed, who's on the bookstore, about that. We'll take your details and we'll sort that out. That's right, isn't it, Jen?
It is, if you want me to put your name in it, or happy birthday, or a dirty joke, or some opinions about the correct places to store colanders, then I have all of those.
Is it best if Richard stays in here to sign books and people come back in?
Absolutely, that's how I'm going to end it. If you do want to get a copy of Richard's book signed, it's going to hang around in here for a little while. Go out and purchase outside and back in. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Bye, Jen.
Are you so cool? All right.
I run quite late.
I'm on the phone. I thought